Hello. Week 8. I don't know if it's as hard for you to believe as it is for me that we are here for the last lecture. We're into the last week of discussion here in our online discussion blocks, and you're getting ready to do your final paper, whether it's your theological reflection in preparation for ordination council, or whether or not you're working on material that you might be able to use in worship as part of an offering meditation or a communion invitation, or even a newsletter article talking about the wider church. But however you're preparing and doing your final paper, this is the final lecture. And there's so much I'd like to say, and blessedly, only so much time I can really use on this platform to say it. So let me get right into it. Our last week themed ecumenism and the design. The design whose form really took final shape in 1968, and by 1969 was our governing document from the provisional design to the design for the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, the point at which our movement became a denomination. And that's an accusation, in fact, in some people's mouths, to say that our branch of the Restoration movement chose to become a denomination. And even within some of the more progressive members of our polity, it's been said that we pursued a denominational status and the tools of denominational life as a Christian communion, just as denominations perhaps were becoming less relevant or less ideal. I think that can be disputed. It's interesting to look at the history, say, of the United Methodist Church, and I've addressed in some of our discussion how their struggles, in fact, their pending separation, show that their steps in the late 60s and early 70s are themselves now up for grabs here in the second decade of the 2000s. And even the Presbyterian Church USA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, most of our other mainline Protestant fellow organizations came together in their current form right about the same time we did. Only the United Church of Christ has an origin in the 1950s, and that from the congregational church side of the movement, and the more German and European ENR, evangelical and reform churches, and those movements coming together to become what we think of as the UCC. But they have a complicated history that was not fully formed even when it was approved in 1957, and is itself still undergoing strains. So the whole question of modern bureaucracy and structure and general or national church, depending on what's relevant, we of course general because it's the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ in the United States and Canada, albeit with the Christian Church in Puerto Rico, an entirely separate communion itself. But we are a general church, since we're not just a national church, in the same way the United Methodist Church is somewhat unique in that it includes many African conferences, and that itself is part of the struggles they're going through. In fact, I'll just say before I go further down that line that I'm going to post simply as kind of a bonus here for you all, a reading list of all the things I didn't assign but thought about. And you'll be very glad that I didn't assign all of them when you see them, but it just gets into the whole self-editing process of what is helpful, what is useful, and what is reasonable. And I'll be the first to admit, week 1 readings here are unreasonable. I can hope that some people might have read some of what's assigned for that first week already, but the reality is many people come to the questions of history and polity from scratch or from a different tradition. So there's quite a steep learning curve at the outset, but I hope the pace has become steadier, and now you're starting to incorporate perhaps your own experience, perhaps the experience of Christian communions that adjoin you a little more easily. And I keep coming back to that because we as the disciples of Christ tend to not have as much of a unique and distinctive identity as many of our fellow Protestant church groups. And so when we're we're living out our common life in the structure, in the governance documents, and the kinds of meetings and authority structures that we create within our congregations. Very often people come in, and I've alluded to this before, they say, well, the Methodist church down the street's doing this, so are we going to do that too? And that can go anywhere from, is somebody from the general or regional office going to take you as the pastor out and put a new person in? That's a chance to teach about polity. What's different about being a congregational versus a connectional polity? And we are, of course, congregational to a fault. So no, the region won't come in and say, Jeff, it's time for you to go, or come into a church and say, hey, guess what? You get Jeff from this June 1st to next June 1st. And that kind of connectional polity is what many people are used to. So they have to learn the difference. What does it mean to be congregational? In the same way, the growing prevalence of non-denominational Christian churches leaves people, I think, even more confused as to what proper governance is or what the roles are there should be in a church. And I've got to tell you, having worked with a fair number of non-denominational Christian churches in the communities I've served in the last 20 years, I have to say, with a lack usually of seminary education, sometimes even of college education, I've had wonderful but fascinating discussions with their leaders, their pastors, who say to me things like, so now, what exactly is an elder, Jeff, biblically? Help me understand that. Or now, I've heard about how the Methodists use deacons, and we kind of just use deacons as ushers, but what is a deacon biblically, theologically? There's a general lack of awareness or understanding about where these things come from. And that's part of why we, in our polity and in our governance, say if you're going to pursue ordination, if you're going to pursue commission status in ministry leadership, you need to know a little something about where we draw our understandings from, what branch of history, in our case, extremely reformed, but not entirely, but those reformed direct influences, but then those kind of Anglican borrowed influences that we have. And for most disciples' churches, when we've been influenced by the Anglican church, which would startle, I think, an awful lot of disciples, we've borrowed it by way of its child, the Methodist Church, which, again, remember, or at least I hope you are remembering it and not learning it, but John Wesley was a priest of the Church of England, as was his brother Charles. And John Wesley, he said proudly, never left the Church of England, but he took out of the Church of England the movement which we know of as Methodist or Wesleyan, or all the different groups that spring out of that. So today, in your average Disciples of Christ church, we've got leaders who have seen and heard influences from the Baptist church down the street, from the Church of the Nazarene, which itself then is descended out of the Methodist church, out of the Anglican church. So then there's some Pentecostal influences that rattle around the edges. We've talked in our discussions about Messianic Christians and how aspects of the Jewish tradition can be understood and even made use of in our understandings of worship and communion. But I want to step back one last time, and I'm going to go back actually into my childhood and note that there was a laity Sunday when I was very young, and it was basically a woman of the church, a layman of the church, and as youth, they called on me. And I would say restructure had just taken place. The design had just been passed, but just barely. And I've got to tell you, in Valparaiso, Indiana, I don't think they knew it. And I certainly hadn't heard of it. But young, somewhat precocious grade schooler that I was, my part of the Laity Sunday sermon was a message to the congregation saying, ironically, we need to help our youth and each other understand who we are and where we came from. You can kind of see how I ended up where I am now, teaching this class, I guess. But it grew out of a conversation I had in, as I recall, a fifth grade class, and kids were talking about where they went to church. And one kid said, well, my family's Presbyterian. And another kid said, well, my family's Methodist. And somebody turned to me and said, what are you? And I said, well, I'm a Christian. And they said, well, yeah, dummy, we all are, which at that point in time in that place was true. But, Lutheran, which was most common in town, or Presbyterian or Methodist, what kind of Christian? And I realized at 10, 11 years old, I didn't know the answer to that. Now here I am 60 some, and I'm still working on exactly how to answer that. I've learned that our forebears in the faith said, we are not the only Christians, but we would be Christians only. No creed but Christ, no book but the Bible. That's what Barton Stone and Thomas and Alexander Campbell and Walter Scott, advancing that message out, we're all trying to say and share, is we are really just Christians. Now, a movement grew out of that, the Restoration Movement, and that movement gave birth to different expressions, and one of them, our own, is now more denominational, a little bit more structured, and has a few more parameters around ministry than, say, our fellow traditions have. And as I've alluded to twice, but you'll have to look at that book list of books I'm not making you read to get a little more of, we have more connections, at least in early days, to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as Mormons, than you might realize. And looking at how they approach worship and ministry is in fact remarkably similar to what Alexander Campbell was talking about, at least through the 1820s and into the early 1830s. But here we are, the kind of communion, the kind of polity, the kind of governance that we have now, and as a group of freely associating congregations which have become a kind of denomination, which most of us accept as a term justly applied to us, we do struggle with the fact that it's still the case that we can end up saying who we are by what we don't do more than by what we affirm. We don't say creeds, which is true. As I've said before, the real deal is that we don't use creeds as a test of fellowship, but still, it's true, we don't use creeds. And we don't really have a set liturgy. We don't have a service book, even a book of worship as the Methodists do. We have materials and different hymnals, but not even all of our churches use chalice hymnal. So we don't have any kind of shared or coordinated liturgy. And we don't require that clergy be at the table to serve communion, although that tends to be the case in more churches than not. And we don't tend to have a whole lot of rules about how churches govern themselves, or you see where I'm going with this. It's a definition by the via negativa. We keep saying, well, we don't do that, or we don't have that. And I think it is important to get back to the question, but who are you? What are you for, you disciples? And a non-answer to that question is itself, I think, part of the answer to it, which is you have to decide that in many cases for yourself, because that is who we are as the disciples of Christ. We're a church that says, beyond a very basic confession of faith that Jesus is the Christ, we don't say, while still holding onto the hand of somebody who's come forward to join, and do you believe in it this way? Or do you agree also in that? Or no, it's the simple confession, the good confession. Do you believe that Jesus is the Christ? If so, you are welcome. And now the hard work starts, which is working out, what does that mean to say Jesus is the Christ? How will we live that out, both individually and as a community? And what does that mean for us as a church? In the Disciples of Christ, in the last 10 years, we've been working very hard to say, okay, so we're definitely not a connectional church. We're a congregational body by history, by heritage, and by most of our governance, but What would it mean for us to become a more covenantal church? I've read some documents where people try to imply that we've been covenantal from the get-go. And again, I think that's kind of reading back into our history, something we want to see there. I'm going to say as a historian and as a pastor, no, we've been pretty ruthlessly congregational and even individualistic from the beginning. And we've run up against the limits of that, the problems of that, the ways in which hyper-individualism, the way an obsession with kind of Americanized individualism is even sometimes contrary to the gospel we wish to proclaim. So we're working on that. And one way we work on that is that term to become more covenantal in our relationships with each other in a church, between churches, and as a wider church. The ministerial code of ethics is one expression of it. And there exists a congregational code of ethics, although it's not as well known, and again, can't be imposed on any church. So what are we? What can we affirmatively say about ourselves? I'm going to be stuck backing into the negative form one more time to say, what's interesting looking at our history over this last century is that a great many of the things that did set us apart, that made us who we are, no longer look quite so distinctive. And that, I think, contributes to a certain amount of confusion and uncertainty about who we are now and who we're trying to be as we live into the future that God is opening up before us. We were, from 1801, 1804, 1809, some of those founding events around Stone and Campbell, we were a church that said, the table is open, come and receive. Friends, that was crazy, out there, wild, weird stuff that took some pretty tough theological defense for us to sustain out in the public square. Most churches, and I'm talking about the forebears of the traditions that are now the mainline Protestant churches that we most closely work with in the communities we tend to be in, they still, until this past century and even the past 70 years or so, tended to say, but you can't have communion here unless you're a member at least of our communion, if not of this church. Now, granted, that's still true. In the Catholic Church, for instance, in other traditions, they will fence the table still. But in fact, in large part, that's become a battle that's been won, to use the Marshall metaphor. We say that we stand for the open table. Well, that's almost taken as a given in an awful lot of contemporary Christian worship type non-denominational churches. Of course, anyone can receive communion. So that doesn't make us quite so distinctive. Receiving communion every Sunday, we do, but we do it as a tradition. I'm not sure we understand why or where from we practice that. And the role of ministry. And that's where in the ecumenical readings, you'll see where the tension between our restoration plea for the simplicity of reading the gospel, especially Acts and the epistles, and say, how did the early church do it, is in tension with what's sometimes called the great tradition, how Christian churches in the last 2,000 years have understood the offices of elder and deacon, often both of those in a very ministerial perspective, and how in so many of all the other Christian traditions we would be in relationship with and seeking Christian unity with, they still hold ministry to be something very much set apart. And candidly, that's very different than where most of our tradition and history has taken us. So we're still wrestling with those questions. And throughout your time in ministry and leadership and as a Christian, you're going to be wrestling with them too. As a mentor of mine said, as he was very old, when I was very young, he liked to talk about when people passed on, being promoted from the church militant to the church triumphant. Well, the church militant, the church at work, the church advancing out into the world to share good news, anticipates that unity which our originators, Barton Stone, Thomas and Alexander Campbell, Walter Scott, all the rest, the ones that you've written about so beautifully in your essays about individuals. They're talking about that unity in the church triumphant that already is. And I think that's the great genius of our movement, and something we can continue to teach and preach, that the Church of Christ upon earth is essentially, intentionally, and constitutionally one. Not someday when we get some institutional form to wrap around it, but to borrow Thomas Campbell's words in a slightly different way, he's theologically affirming it is already so. In Christ we are made one. And how shall we live that out as disciples of Christ and as simply Christians? Friends, it's been wonderful to share this class with you. I hope you've been blessed by it, and I look forward to your final papers. Go in peace. Amen.